Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I am a professional writer and editor for the last 10 years, and I'm very excited for this episode, actually, because we have another email from a listener, and I haven't read the email yet, but I know what it's about. So our producer, Natalia Emmons, sent this along, and she let me know that it's about time magic. So I have a few thoughts already kind of in my head, but we're going to read the actual email and get into it ASAP. So let's do it. Okay, this comes to us from Rin. Subject line, writing a time magic novel and spiraling about it. Been there. Hi, John and Natalia, if you're reading this. I've been listening to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians for a few months now, and I just want to say how much I appreciate the way you make writing advice feel approachable and grounded. Thank you. Especially when I'm spiraling about my project, which is often. I'm currently working on a fantasy novel that heavily involves time magic. It's not quite time travel in the traditional sense, more like a bending, slowing, looping time within a confined magical system. But the deeper I get into outlining and drafting, the more nervous I get. I know how time stuff can break people's brains if it's not super tight, and I'm terrified of creating a world full of logic holes. I have bad news. You're going to no matter what, even if it's a great novel, but that's okay. Sometimes it feels like every time, pun not intended, I solve one paradox, I create 5 more. It's got me second guessing whether I can even pull this off, or if readers will just tap out because it's too convoluted or gimmicky. Do you have any advice on writing time magic without going insane or alienating your audience? How do you make it feel coherent and emotionally resonant without over-explaining everything? Thanks so much for everything you do. Your show genuinely makes me feel less alone in this process. All the best, Rin. Awesome. Loved that email. And the first thing I want to say is that no matter what kind of novel you're doing, you're always going to run into things that make you second guess whether you're the exact right person to write it. And the key is to just embrace that instability and understand that it's part of the process. You sort of have to just acknowledge that you're going to feel those big feelings and try to navigate them as best you can. That's best for yourself. Everybody's going to deal with it a little bit differently. Time magic is a tough thing. It's a very tricky thing. But I want to start with the positives. Time magic can be seriously cool to write and to read and enjoy. Time magic can be very flashy. It can be cerebral. There's a lot of literary fantasy that deals with time, for example. And it can deal with mind-bending subject matter that people genuinely like. But also, time magic in narrative terms, it's sort of like wildfire. You know, it can illuminate your story, but it can also burn the whole thing down if you're not careful. So I think I can help with that. I do have my own set of expectations and principles that I try to abide by when I'm writing time magic. I don't write a ton of it, but I have done it in novel form and a little bit in short story form too. So I do have some experience with this. And in terms of editing too, the most common failure I see with time magic from people who are trying to write it and they're submitting me things is when their time magic feels way too much like a cheat code. That is one of the biggest things. And it's the sort of thing where characters will undo consequences and reset the plot. And also, this is even worse, they'll confuse the reader so much that they no longer care about what's happening. So there are different ways to avoid this and to fix this too, if it's already showing up in your work. And I think before we really dig into these, we should definitely have some clear definitions and some categorization for the types of time magic you might be dealing with. And I see Rin has, already kind of specified their sort of time magic. So we'll see where that falls on this kind of makeshift list. I'm sure I'm going to leave plenty of stuff out here, but when I think of time magic, the first thing I think about is like prophecy time magic. So this is like precognition stuff. So visions of the future. Usually there's a lot of ambiguity around this kind of thing and, pretty common, especially for chosen one type stories. You also have the classic time travel type of time magic. And clearly this is not what Rin is dealing with, but, this is going forward and backward in time, dealing with different timelines, that sort of thing. And this one, usually it's a very high risk to writing time travel, but there can be a very high payoff. So just keep in mind, Avengers Endgame deals with time travel. High risk, but it's one of the best, box office movies ever made. So that happens. That happened to work out. And then you have temporal manipulation. So this is like a time magic where you can like freeze time, or like Prince of Persia. I was trying to think. Prince of Persia in the Sands of Time, same kind of thing. You can slow down time. You can loop time yourself. Black Clover is another good example of this. Although Black Clover would be even better for chronomancy. So this isn't one I always see being talked about, but this is when you apply time magic to sort of full blown wizardry. So it involves the flow of time, but also spells and everything that kind of, has to deal with like fate and weaponizing fate through a very concrete magic system. So this is very much like Wheel of Time stuff, for example. I think for me, when I'm trying to think like I have a time travel idea and I want to make sure it's tight. I think that was the word that Rin used. I think Brandon Sanderson is going to be one of the best references for this. Now, I've talked about Sanderson plenty of times before. If you don't know him, he's like one of the like all-time prolific fantasy authors, definitely of the modern time. And he has these laws, like Sanderson's laws, when it comes to his magic systems. I think we talked about it in our magic system episode, but I think that he's one of the best resources for just trying to pressure test your magic system, make sure it doesn't suck in terms of like how it's actually accomplishing what it's trying to accomplish. And the way I see it, there are 3 laws that apply really well to time magic stuff in particular. So one of the first one, or the first one I should say, is that your reader really has to understand your magic system, your time magic system, and how it works if you are going to use it to solve problems. Specifically, you do not want any time magic to feel like a Deus Ex Machina or a Deus Ex Time Traveler or whatever. You want it to feel earned. You want it to feel properly explained and understood. It cannot come out of nowhere, right? So you have to properly explain it. It's tough to do because, you don't want to write so much exposition that people get bored, but you also want to layer it into the story so that people grasp it and they organically understand what you're trying to get across. Applies to all magic systems, but especially time magic. Sanderson's second law has to do with limitations within the magic system and how that needs to be way more thought out than the powers themselves, or at least they should be kind of equal. Another way to think of it is limitations should have greater attention from you, the author, than the powers themselves. So your time mage, for example, has to be paying some kind of cost or suffering a consequence. And I'll dive into this actually a little bit more later. I'll get to the third law first, though. The third law, really important, very underrated. You need to start small with your magic system. You need to start small and then expand what you already have before you start throwing in new elements. This is really important. I see it all the time where we're just starting to wrap our heads around a magic system and time magic in particular. It's like, okay, we have these branching timelines. Okay, sure. They can freeze time. Okay. But then you start throwing in random other stuff that it complicates it and it feels totally unwieldy. So you want to avoid that as much as possible. So if you take Sanderson's 3 laws, you can turn them into 3 pillars of time magic. So you can start with cost, right? So that's a great pillar. So time magic should have a cost. It should feel like you are pulling something from your soul, your bone marrow in your world in order to make time magic possible. So for example, maybe it ages the user. Maybe it erases their memories. Maybe it invites some kind of like dark temporal creature to come clean up the mess. So think like the TVA in Loki, the TV show. The cost is what's going to create those stakes, and stakes are so important. A good example for me is that I have a character in one of my fantasy novels who can see a few seconds into the future. And the cost here has more to do with how when she does this, it's not necessarily a cost in the sense that it's like in the magic system, but it's a personal cost. She can accidentally expose that she has these powers, and it's in a world where these powers are taboo, right? So you can have social costs. The more that this character uses her sort of time magic, the more at risk she is to being discovered and caught and her freedom taken away. So there's ways to do this even outside the magic system. It just sort of depends on how you handle it. So the second pillar then would be layering the limitations of how this works, the where, the when, the how, and for how long does the time magic itself work. You need to define these rules for yourself, and then you need to properly transcribe these rules for the reader in a way that makes sense. So the time magic itself, does it change when the person is under stress, for example? Can everybody do it? Or is it just a few people who can do it? I think the tighter the leash that you have, the bigger the drama you can create, and you can settle in on like one or two really key aspects for your time magic that affects the world around it. And then finally, consequence. So this would be the third pillar. And consequence means that like every time related action has to create some kind of new ripple, right, within the plot. Even if you're trying to do something good, like save someone's life or prevent a war, that can spiral into disaster. So that should be honestly the engine of your story, right? I just watched Superman, the new James Gunn Superman, earlier this week, and it has a great kind of commentary on this of like one action, that with good intentions spirals into this bigger thing. And time magic works really well with that same kind of concept because people understand that time is so delicate and fragile. And so you can play into that expectation a little bit and do that without causing confusion. But okay, so I see that Rin was definitely getting into this idea that like, okay, they're super worried that it's going to be overwhelming. And they're getting nervous about the complexity, the confusion. So specifically, I think there are some really common pitfalls that people run into with time magic. So we can start there and really identify what those pitfalls are. There are a few actually that are pretty common. I think the grandfather paradox is the first one I think of. So that's the paradox of like, you go back to kill your grandfather, how's that possible? Because then you would cease to exist, right? Back to the Future kind of deals with this by not dealing with it, quite honestly. So to avoid the grandfather paradox, you sort of have to decide up front, right? Like how your world handles that. Is it alternate timelines? Is it paradox immunity? Or is it immutable history? As the author, you kind of have to identify that and get ahead of it so that the reader isn't asking those questions at the wrong time. I don't think this applies directly to Rin because it sounds like Rin isn't really dealing with time travel stuff. I think for Rin, well, first I want to say there's the information loop, which also doesn't really apply to Rin. Sorry. But it is important for a lot of other folks who might be watching or listening to this and might be dealing with it. So the information loop, I'm actually dealing with this right now for a short story I'm working on, where if somebody comes to the past from the future and they have knowledge of the future that maybe even causes the event itself, that turns into like a weird paradox because then where did that knowledge actually originate? So Terminator kind of deals with this. This is also known as like the bootstrap paradox, I think. So you really have to handle this with care. I think Looper, another good example too. Sometimes the answers to these questions is sort of lampshaded with like, no one gets it. No one understands. It's mysterious. I think that can be kind of unsatisfying. So if you can avoid this, if you can have a good reason, take some time to think it through because that might be very helpful for you. But anyway, I think this might apply to Rin a little bit more, and that's the reset button problem. So the reset button problem, I kind of alluded to it earlier. This is where it feels like Deus Ex Machina. And it feels like, okay, if characters can just rewind time, why should the readers care? Where's the tension, right? This is something that people complain about all the time with Harry Potter and like the time turner stuff. It's like, why don't they use the time turner for like all of these problems that are happening? And so like Rowling just didn't, that old turf, she did not find a way to kind of properly explain that, at least within the text. And so there are a lot of time travel stories that kind of fall into this, or not just time travel, but I think time magic stuff in general. So you got to be really careful of this. I think examples of it done well, though, would be things like, weirdly enough, Lilo and Stitch, the series, had an episode about this that actually was really good. And, it was, of course, inspired by other stories that had done it before. But I think of Primer, definitely. I think of the show Dark on Netflix does this pretty well. Even Time Traveler's Wife, I like how Time Traveler's Life in particular, it really nails like the emotional fallout of like time shenanigans. So those can be good reference points for you if you want to see it done well. Okay, in terms of actually approaching this the right way, I think for time magic, you always have to make it about the character. That should be your cheat code. I think that even if things can get a little wonky, if you always bring it back to the character themselves and where they fit into this time magic stuff, you're going to have way more freedom and flexibility to make it work. So put another way, I think that all of the time magic wizardry stuff doesn't mean a whole lot if it doesn't affect your characters in very meaningful and often irreversible ways. So, for example, like maybe your hero sees like all possible futures and then spirals into this kind of emotional paralysis. So think Dune, great example of that, right? Maybe your time mage or whatever they are has memories from like 5 different timelines and doesn't know what's real anymore. So that would be Wheel of Time kind of. Another good example would be like maybe somebody gave up their entire lifetime to buy somebody else like 10 minutes. So there you're kind of weaving in a romantic sort of thing, even if it's platonic. In these cases, what you're doing is you're using time magic to mess with your characters' relationships, their sense of identity, their regrets, and their hopes. Because ultimately, time stories, they're not about, or they are about, sorry, the one thing we all wrestle with, the different choices we make that we cannot undo. So, in that sense, sometimes the mistakes we make that we cannot undo. And if you're like me, I love building time magic around the way that people will engage with it after the fact, where they'll craft theories and discussions that really dive into the lore and complexity. So you always leave them guessing. I don't love it when stories try to cram all of the answers and explanations into the text. You have to leave, not have to, but you should leave some room for people to ponder and think. This is where your fantasy can become more literary rather than uber commercial. Most of the time, the best you can probably hope for is more of an upmarket fantasy. So that's more like in between, like literary and commercial. That just means that it has some literary quality to it, like I'm saying, but it's still commercial enough for lots and lots of people to enjoy it at the same level. And if you do that, you layer in all this room for people to find layers, to find little nuggets of insights that maybe they aren't totally sure about, if that makes sense. Like, why did this character do this? And then you have a book club talking about it. I think that can be super fun. And as the author, you can do that. You can leave room for that by planting little seeds, putting in purposely some like contradictions. And then you can let fans of your work, readers of your work, argue and debate around whether the timeline you've created was always meant to be broken, whatever it is, right? So what you're doing here in essence is you are creating a timeline that has some chaos to it, but there is an underlying logic the whole way through, right? So that should be the end result if you're lucky. I think one of the secrets to doing this right too is that your story itself, it should not be about the time magic. I don't think any of these stories we write in fantasy should be about the magic itself. It needs to be about what the magic represents. In this case, time and our relationship to time in real life. How we in our real lives, we fear time, the passage of it, how little of it we have left, how we waste our time, right? How we want to control time, to rewrite time, to go back into the past, to do this and do that, and how no matter what, time always beats us in the end. It always wins out. And how do humans wrestle with that? Well, that's where your story can kind of come in, right? So, yeah, if you are listening to this and you're feeling kind of similar to Rin, don't be afraid too much of how tough this can be, the loops and all that. Lean into the complexity. It can be an advantage. The expectations that readers have for time magic actually can be an opportunity for you to write this story on your terms and let it be complex because they're going to give you extra leeway to make it work. But always ground the time magic system in what we were talking about, which is the cost, the consequences, the limitations, and most importantly, the character. Build for your readers build a time magic system for your readers who love the ongoing discussion after the fact, and reward everyone else with some kind of emotional payoff that they can really feel when it comes down to it. And if you are cooking up something like this in terms of like rule breaking magic systems, email is always open. You can hit us up and we can do some follow up to this. But fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com is how you hit us up. Thank you so much to Rin for sending us this topic. Really fun to talk about. And if you like our show, please take a few seconds to subscribe on YouTube if that's where you found us, or subscribe, leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever it is. Before we go, I do want to let you know that if you are curious what I'm up to in terms of writing, I do have a weekly short story Substack. It's totally free that you can sign up for. I write multiple genres, including fantasy, of course, but a lot of speculative stuff too, especially lately. It's called Cetera. And we have another podcast where we have audio versions of our short stories. So it's called Worlds Without Warning, if you want to check that out. But it's also on this channel too. So you can find that on this channel, John Negroni, if you're a YouTube person as well. So again, totally free. It's something that I've been working on with Natalia and Bridget as well. And it's just a labor of love. We really enjoy writing these stories. Natalia is working on her first story. She's really excited and nervous. It's not time magic, but I'm very excited for folks to see some of Natalia's writing. You can also find writing from other people as well on that. So definitely check it out if you're interested. But with that, I'll leave you there. Be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.